Hi there, welcome to the archives. So this episode is called A Brief History of Public Shaming. I have a few blogs that I've already, I said today I'm going to work on my ums and ahs, and I already read that too. Okay, so there's a few blogs that I did previously that spoke to Greece, ancient Greece, how in Greece, what was it? Grief was illegal. If you see me pausing, that's because I'm trying to not say or So what I decided to do for this one, I'm going to read an excerpt from my PhD dissertation, and it's a section that's called A Brief History of Public Shaming. All to say, this episode is called A Brief History of Public Shaming. I don't know why that took so long to say. So this one is a little bit long, so I'm going to get going. When it comes to public shaming, Peter Stearns, a historian, noted an exaggeration in research findings in places like ancient Japan and colonial America, which were known for public stocks, or in Babylonian law, which was known for public slaps. Public shaming in Europe accelerated in frequency after the late Middle Ages, due in part to Christianity, advances in medicine, and chivalric culture, said Stearns. For example, the concept of manners only took shape during the Renaissance, as early modern Europeans used shame to instill etiquette practices at the community and familial level. So there's a lot of things that we just assume are just natural and have always been there, such as etiquette. Etiquette actually was born out of Europe. It's a European thing that has, because of European colonization, if we're speaking specifically of British colonization, has spread to international places such as the Commonwealth, right? So manners, there's another word I'm forgetting. Manners, respectability, politics. There's another word. I'm not remembering it right now. But all of these took shape during the Renaissance. And specifically, you were shaming people who had poor etiquette, and that was a way of, it was a practice that kept people, families, communities proper. So for European elites, enforcing manners was meant to control disruptive emotions, such violence and bodily excess. This is what Peter Stearns says, and you can find that in his book on 2017 on page 42. So the arrival of manners was to control people, to control their bodily excess, like things that weren't seen as excessive emotions, disruptive emotions. Manners was created to kind of curb it. But shame was understood in different ways as well too. So in other instances, not observing the Sabbath was a shameful offense. During the mid-1600s, forgery and counterfeiting was a thing as well too. In Britain, forgers were put in public stocks with a piece of paper on their head. Adulterers, so people who cheated on their partners, were paraded through with a mocking crown. Bad musicians were giving special flutes just to mock them as like terrible musicians. In Europe and North America, dunce caps were given to disobedient students in the form of punishment. So I don't know if you guys know, but they would put students in the corner and they'd have to wear a dunce cap, and that was meant to shame them for being bad in class. Grading and marking rubrics were also rooted in competition, were also a form of shame, right? So if you have, it's kind of like when you have in your class and then they put everybody's name, like you got an A, you got a C, that kind of shame that students were supposed to feel for getting a C was also to motivate them into getting better grades, right? So here, these are all some of the different ways that shame becomes productive to a society. So those who practiced medicine without the standard qualifications were made to sit backwards on donkeys. Same with, I shared that in a previous blog. So if you were practicing medicine and you didn't have the qualifications, they made you sit on donkeys. And then you were paraded and marched through town. Sex workers were carried around in barrels. Like, I don't understand where they came up with any of this. So if you were doing sex work, what was formerly or known to some people as prostitution, then they would carry you around in a barrel. Perjurers were mocked with a wooden horse. And at times, individuals were shamed. They wore a bell to draw a large crowd. So you just, every step you took, the bell would be clink-clacking, and then people would be looking at you. And that was a form of shaming people as well. People's faces, this is again in the European context, right? So white communities, what they would do is they would put blackened soot on their face, which is very reminiscent of like blackface. And that was people were supposed to laugh at you because you had done something that was considered shameful. By the 17th and 18th centuries, Western Europe, that's like Britain, for instance, they had expanded Germany is also Western Europe, from my understanding. But Western Europe, this had expanded shame's range considerably as practices that were once routine or considered shameful, it performed in public. So things like urination, flatulence, right, farting, those things became shameful around the 17th and the 18th century. There's a quote, one should make sacrifices with the buttocks firmly pressed together. So the idea was you weren't supposed to fart, you were supposed to make a sacrifice with your buttocks pressed firmly together. That's a terrible accent, but that was the idea, right? Farting is shameful, it's better to keep it in. Note that in ancient Greece, men could once they can attend outdoor parties completely naked. It was not shameful before in ancient Greece to go to a party completely naked, including in front of their servants. This changed in the 17th century as nakedness in public began to be considered shameful and covering up was instituted in law. So again, some things like covering up, being naked, it was completely okay. In a lot of societies, it was okay for you to be naked. You hear of like the toga parties where they would cover. Now, cut to the 17th century, that's when you start to find the association of nakedness with something that is shameful, especially in public. So you weren't supposed to be naked in public because that was considered shameful, and it was instituted in law in the 17th century. So that's when, if you were topless in public, you could be criminalized for that. So in this way, shame not only transformed experiences for women and girls, but also determined how boys and men perform masculinity. So terms like sissy, which were used affectionately to describe one's sister in the 1840s, people called their sister sissy, and that was supposed to be like an affectionate term back in the 1840s. Some people use sissy now to refer to their sisters, but by 1880, it was used to shame boys and men who did not perform the physical, dominant, kind of like emotionally stoic masculinity that was mandated at the time. So sissy as a negative derogatory term, that comes into place around 1880s. Other terms such as crybaby were used as a show of strength as boys challenged each other while playing. And then they would dare each other in different games. So gaming is also, there's a lot of shame that's tied to gaming and sports, right? So if you didn't do something, if you couldn't like run and like do Nicky Nicky Nine Door, you'd be shamed. You were a cry. If a ball hit you when you started crying, then you'd be a crybaby, right? So sissy, all of these different terms that are associated with shame, it starts to now also impact men and boys. The rise in sports intensified this nuance of shame. So it constructed masculinity in a very particular way that excluded those who performed gender differently than the stereotypical male athlete, for instance. So if you weren't a male athlete, if you weren't strong, if you didn't have the muscles, if you were like weak or bony, skinny, chicken legs, these were things that men would be shamed for. American sports like football were said to be the marker of men and like malehood, manness. and it excluded women from sports as the norm. So women, it was to play sports as a woman was something that was shameful. That was for the boys. Not only was that for the boys, it was for the manly men. And what we find is scripts like "you're throwing like a girl." That all starts to show up around this era. Calling those who perform women like women, right? So if men, you're throwing the baseball like a girl. That was to shame you to do better as a baseball player or as an athlete. To be associated with women was something that was considered shameful. So coaches were also a key culprit in normalizing the use of shame in sports, and they would berate their players for perceived failure and often in front of others. And we still find this today where coaches will shame teammates for not performing properly. And again, shame here is supposed to be something that is used to control that person, that is used to motivate them into playing as a better athlete. So these are all some of the different ways in which we find shame being used historically. Also, shame is tied to a lot of the failure around class, business, and socioeconomic status. So poor people were also shamed. That's been time immemorial. But if you failed as a business owner, there was shame associated around that. If you credit scores, if you had a poor credit, we find all of that emerging around the 17th, 18th, 19th century. So it was in the mid-18th century, after 1750, that drastic changes on how shame was understood and punished took place. So Western innovators believed that shame needed major reconsiderations with more emphasis put on human dignity and covering up. Again, I spoke about this earlier. An innovation that led to the emergence of like nightgowns, for instance. So mid-18th century, we find the nightgowns. Like now people have to cover up to go to sleep because it's shameful to sleep at night without a nightgown. So that all emerged in the mid-1800s. By the middle of the late 18th century, using corporal punishment as part of penal reform, including torture and capital punishment, became very popular in public shaming. So Western Europeans, especially the British colonists, they instituted some of the harshest public shaming. This is what Aaron Book, one of the authors I read in Shame on You, an analysis of modern shame punishment as an alternative to incarceration. So Aaron Book was saying that Western Europeans, specifically the British, were some of the worst around public shaming. So he says that shame individuals were sent to the pillory, the bilboes, the branks, ducking stools, and stocks. And basically these were considered, like, you know, like how they had the horse stalls. These were stalls that you can go in the middle of the public and you would stand there and everybody would be staring at you and it was supposed to mark you as shameful. Or they would have their hands, their heads, or their ears chopped off. They would have their forehead branded. They would have their bodies mutilated, or their hair would be shaved off. All of these different things was punishment for somebody who had done something wrong, and it was to let them know and it was to communicate to the community that this is a shameful person. You saw somebody with a shaved head, at that time, it was a marker that they had done something shameful. If they had a branding on their forehead, it was to let people know that they've done something shameful. This is how we punish people publicly for doing things that were shameful. And so it's called communicative social practice. Again, it's to communicate to the community that this is a person who is shameful. Here, shame was used to let the community know that an individual had their head shaved was to be excluded. So you were supposed to exclude somebody who had their head branded or who had their head shaved. All of these were supposed to communicate shame in different ways. So prior to the birth of prisons, penitentiaries and jails, shame penalties included decapitation, I talked about this, branding on the forehead, standing naked in public stocks for hours, sometimes even days. And Aaron Book says the punitive European societies wiped out sin by wiping out the sinner, including death. And these same Europeans then brought the practice of public shaming with them to the North America. So when the Pilgrims arrived, when the colonizers arrived in Turtle Island, what's now known as North America, they brought these same practices of public shaming with them to New England, though it was less harsh than in Europe. And even less harsh, it still was pretty brutal. So what would tend to happen still, because it was still tied to, say, for like the British monarchy, for instance, they adopted these barbarous and inhumane, this is a quote, that's not me, shame-based systems, much like those that were practices in Westworld, in the old world centuries prior. So in 19th century, colonial New England, so in America as we know it proper, so that would be places like Massachusetts, the coast, public shaming was central to controlling people and more favorable than punitive corporal punishments. In the New World, Stearns notes that shaming was tailored to the offense and it compared to other forms of punishment. So, for example, those who are accused of adultery, again, if adultery being like you're cheating on your husband or your wife, often in these cases it was women, so if you were cheating on your husband, then you were required to wear a letter A for adultery, on your body. And this is where we get the scarlet S from. And then you would have to stand in a scaffold for hours. So you're standing in the scaffold with this huge A on your body and everybody sees you. They know you committed adultery. A person who stole a pair of pants was required by Virginia law to spend hours in the stocks with a pair of birches on their head. Right? So this is the shame is matching the penalty. You stole pants, you're wearing pants on your head. You committed adultery, you're wearing an A on your body. Who comes up with this? So in Williamsburg, Virginia, a thief could have their ear nailed to a wooden brace in the pillory, and how long they were nailed for was determined by the severity of their crime. So afterwards, once they were done, the authorities will pull them from the pillory without first removing the nail. And this is where we get the term earmarked. So your ear is nailed into wood. You have to stand there for hours bleeding. People are watching you, ha ha ha. It's like this person did something so shameful. Like humans are fucked. And then they don't take the courtesy of pulling the nail out. They just pull your ear. And these practices were supposedly an improvement from what was happening in Europe. With this lineage in mind, I want us to consider and to begin understanding why white conservatives, especially in America, who are anti-critical race crusaders, want nothing to do with shame. If you have this history of shame as from European descendants, even if you're an white Americans still came from Europe. This is a history of shame. You are going to be no wonder you want nothing to do with shame, right? No one wants anything to do with shame, and never mind this type of a history. But facing their history could be especially challenging, given that these were some of the things that they experienced. And so I'm going to leave that for a previous blog where I bring in the critical race theories piece. This one, I just wanted to give us a brief understanding of public shaming, what it looked like in the past and over the different centuries, and then we can begin to understand why it's so hard. It's so hard for a lot of us to feel shame, right? I don't think it's just because shame itself is hard. I think the way in which we, as humans, and I'm speaking as a Black woman, but also I want white body people to consider this. If your ancestors dealt with this level of punishment that shamed them, would you that is in your cellular level? That is a trauma, right? That is DNA. That is ancestral. You don't want to touch shame. If somebody calling you out in public reminds you of getting your ear pulled, and you don't even know that your ear was, you don't even have that recollection, because that's how trauma works. You don't have to experience something to feel the trauma. Residential school survivors, there's second generations. The children born to residential school survivors, they themselves weren't in residential schools, but there's that trauma that still lingers. Folks, wars, people who have ancestors that were in war, that still shows up in generations after, even though you weren't at war. So I want us to consider how this type of shame, it still shows up as a trauma that that keeps us to push shame away at all costs, especially when it comes to history. So if you guys want to talk, you want to bring up these histories that make Americans look bad, that make Americans look shameful, people don't want that. You are going to create laws and bans to avoid that at all costs from being taught in school. That's the element that I'm coming from as a shame researcher. I'm going to end it here. Until next time, in solidarity.